Happy March. We made it. We made it to March. And, it seems like it got here in about 5 minutes. March 2023. Oh, my goodness. I started this channel about right at 3 years ago, just when COVID hit. And in a couple of weeks, it'll be the 3-year anniversary that it really, affected us here in the Villages and obviously around the country. I know it got here earlier, but middle of March was really a scary time, and we've come a long way. It seems like 20 years ago in some ways, and then it seems like about just 20 minutes. We're going to talk about inventory right now. We're going to talk about six things that I've noticed that people may not know about buying a home in Florida, and maybe more specifically the Villages, but these are things that you could actually use anywhere in Florida, not just the Villages. And these are things straight from the Florida real estate contract, whether it's as is or non as is. There's some things that you need to know. And of course, by the way, I've done that video before where there is a difference between an as is contract and a standard contract. And believe it or not, the as is contract has a lot of merit to be used for buyers, and it's counterintuitive. A lot of people think that, as is contract, I don't want to buy it as is. There's something wrong with it. There's a lemon. The home is a lemon. I don't want to buy it that way. But the as is gives the buyer a bigger out to escape with their money if they don't like what they see in the inspection. Different video. Watch that. Just kind of put that on YouTube. You can find that video that I did probably about a year ago is what I'm thinking. But the 6 things, we're going to talk about 6 things in a minute that I think are really, really important. As you can tell, 359 homes have hit the market. That is a high. That's like over 2-year high in the Villages. So I feel like that's really interesting. Not surprising. We've been talking about that. Like, inventory is going up. That's what we're seeing right here, right? 359 homes on the market. And when we look at specifically what's happening over the last 7 days, this is going to be a telltale sign. Like, new listings, 54 new listings the last 7 days and only 36 pending. Now, 36 is kind of an average run-of-the-mill number. I feel like, and I'm talking to a lot of people about this, 36 I feel like is a light-ish number. Really, this time of year, we're normally in the probably mid-40s. A couple of years back, if we looked at some of the videos, probably saw maybe about in the 50, 60 range. But normally I would say normal time would be in the mid 40s. 36 is a lightish number, but 36 is a very good number if we're talking about like September, October. So it's a little bit light for March. Closings, if we look at the closed number, 38, which also includes the end of February number, which is, obviously the end of the month is usually when we see most of the closings. So that's a little bit light. The new listing number is probably a normal number at 54 new listings over the last 7 days for MLS. So the inventory is there. There are properties to buy, and I think there's some real opportunities, but inventory is growing, which means that we're probably going to see a little bit of downward pressure. Still, I don't feel like it's a crash, but who knows? You never know. Things could change. I think we're going to see some downward pressure on average sales price as we move forward. And as you can see here, price decrease is 74. So people are reducing their prices. I think, once again, I'm gonna say this again, really, really important, because I know there's some people out there that are a little bit cynical. I'm just gonna wait for the price to come down. Make your offer now. Like, why are you gonna wait for the prices to come down and then there's gonna be more competition? Buyers, if you're interested in buying, no pressure. If it's not the right time, I don't think anybody should buy. But if you're thinking about buying in the next 6 months, I think there's a real opportunity right now. Prices look like they're going to come down a little bit more because we are seeing rising inventory. And then sellers, get to the right price quicker. Get to that right price, right? Leaving room for negotiating right now, I think, is hurting sellers. That's my personal opinion. If you have questions about that, I'd like to see people's comments too, what you're thinking about this. I think is super important. But we're going to jump into the 6 things that I think are, these are not the 6 things that I think are important, but these are 6 things that are important. There's probably about 25. Actually, I put together a list of like 40 plus. If I did that, everybody would fall asleep. So I'm doing this kind of piecemeal. 6 things that you may or may not know about buying and or selling real estate in the Villages in Florida. So the first thing is like a subject to lease. For the people that are interested in buying a property and you notice that there is a lease in place, we have to abide by the lease, whatever the lease says. So if the lease says that they need, the lease has 3 more months in it, 6 more months in it, in Florida, the lease takes precedence. So we can, for lack of a better word, bribe the tenants and ask them to move and maybe find another place for them. And if they do that in advance of the lease ending and expiring, it's okay. But if the lease lasts 6 months and they don't find a place in the next 6 months, that overrides the closing. So just because you sell it, just because you close on it in 90 days, the lease still supersedes the closing, if that makes sense. So if you have questions about that, let me know. By the way, my number is 352-572-3796. If you need help with anything, be happy to help. Second thing is that, and most people know that. If you live in Florida, you know this. If you don't, then you need to know that taxes are paid in arrears, and taxes are prorated when you close on a property. So if you close in at the end of June, then you will get a credit from January 1 all the way to the end of June, all the way to closing date. The buyer gets a credit at closing for what they haven't used, because taxes are paid in August, September, October, in the fall typically. And when that happens, the buyer gets a credit for what they haven't used, and then obviously they're going to have to pay the full tax bill for 2023 when they get their tax bill in the fall. That makes sense. So if your taxes are $2,000 in a year, which I have found taxes are significantly less than South Florida and the Northeast, even though the taxes have gone up, still significantly less than most more expensive states, and a little bit more than some of the rural places like Kentucky, Indiana, and some places that have lighter taxes and maybe lesser valuations than we do here. Hopefully that makes sense. But if the taxes are $2,000 for the year, and they obviously homesteaded, you get principal residence if you're going to be here 6 months in a year, or 6 months in a day rather. You can apply for homestead exemption. That actually just passed for many people because March 1st is that deadline. So hopefully you didn't miss that. But if you do buy here and you're going to live here full time, 6 months in a day or more, then you can apply for homestead exemption, and your taxes will be a little bit less. But to my point on proration, if your taxes are $2,000 for the year and you close June 30th, you're talking about half the year. So essentially, $1,000 will be credited to you as the buyer at closing, and then you're going to be responsible for the full $2,000 in a very simple example. Hopefully that makes sense. Down payment. There's a difference between down payment and escrow. Basic, but I hear people interchange and mix these up. That, I'm going to put a down payment. No, you're not going to put a down payment. You're going to put escrow, and that's not security. That's for rentals. Escrow money, which belongs to both buyer and seller when you put money in escrow. So make sure you understand, and this can be really, really complicated. When you put money in escrow and you're going to buy a home, make sure you understand the consequences of that, because that money is no longer yours. It's yours and the seller's, and you both have to agree to release it. Make sure you're really clear about that. I see a lot of buyers fall into a trap. They put $10,000, $50,000 in escrow, and then there's an issue with inspections and there's a dispute, and they think, I could just walk away. And that may or may not be the case. Understand, either hire an attorney or make sure that your real estate agent, broker, understands the real estate contract enough to help guide you through the process, because that's what our job is to guide people. We don't sell homes, we guide. We give people some consultations and some understanding around how to navigate this whole process, right? So difference between down payment and escrow. Escrow is what you're going to use to bind a property. Good faith money is, or good faith deposit is another way to verbalize that. Down payment is basically what you're going to bring at closing, which would be the difference between the escrow and the financing amount, and whatever's left over is going to be your down payment. If you're financing, if you're just paying cash, it's going to be the difference between the purchase price and whatever your escrow money is going to be, and then obviously down payment is going to come at closing. I think it's something to really look at when you're buying a property and selling. Property maintenance is really key. Understand that as a seller, you should be keeping the property just as it was when the buyer saw it, right? Should be cleaned. Don't leave the place a mess and say, well, it's your problem, and leave it up to the realtors to decide. I think that's bad. Come on. Like, make sure the property's in good shape. I think it's the proper way to do it. It's good juju or whatever. I think it's just the right thing to do. But also, I think it's important that from the buyer standpoint, that you do a walkthrough to make sure the maintenance, maybe if there's repairs involved, that things were done properly. I'm really giving, this is actually, I said 6. This is probably like, I'm thinking this is more like 9 things you need to know about buying and selling in Florida, and specifically in the Villages. So property maintenance, be aware of that. Make sure that you understand that once the property closes, and if you don't have a home warranty attached to it, and I think home warranty is usually a good idea to get, or, negotiate in your contract to have the seller pay for it, or if the seller has a home warranty, it might be a good idea to purchase that in advance. But make sure the property is in good condition, and make sure you're doing walkthroughs to make sure the inspection, all the repairs were done and done properly, right? You might have the home inspector to come back to re-inspect. The 5th thing in my list, but really probably 8 or 9, is making sure that you have proper access to the property. And this is more for the sellers, because sometimes we've seen it in the past where sellers are giving people a hard time about, oh, they're coming back. No, they can't come back in. Like, they're trying to buy the property. As long as they're not coming back every single day and being obnoxious, I think giving reasonable access to people, in a reasonable time, not midnight, or an unusual time for people to come over, I think is the proper thing to do. And of course, they need to have access to do inspections and walkthroughs and make sure utilities are on and people can do their thing, and make sure they're not buying a lemon. And I think it's to your best interest to have buyers look at things, because if there's anything to be done, you don't want problems after closing where people are complaining and filing lawsuits and all that. Cover your basis, and your real estate person can cover that with you. And then the last thing I have for you, which is, coming back, we've seen this recently, a couple of examples of this, and that is kick-out clauses. And kick-out clause is basically a contingency that the buyer places on the property, and that can come in several different forms. But to give you a little bit of expertise on this, typically buyers would do a kick-out clause if they've got a home either for sale, on the market, or about to be on the market, or maybe it's already under contract and it's about to close. Now, there are different, I've given you 3 different scenarios where they can be putting it on the market, and they can be on the market, or they can be under contract. Typically, when they're under contract, wherever they're coming from, typically the kick-out clause is not used, although we saw this recently. It can be negotiated by the seller into the deal. From a buyer's perspective, it's not that fabulous. If you're already under contract and you're closing in 2, 3, 4 weeks, you want to know that you have a property that you're going to be buying. Typically what happens in that case is the buyer will provide a copy of their contract, listing contract, sales contract, whatever, and the listing agent would have access to it, so they can share that with the seller and say, okay, there's proof that they're under contract. And normally the listing agent will have a conversation with the listing agent wherever they're coming from and make sure the deal is legit, that type of thing. So homework and due diligence needs to be done by the seller. But in the kick-out, in a kick-out clause, typically there's going to be a time period that the buyer would be given just in case a secondary contract or offer comes in. So in that case, you're seeing the seller put it on the market, looking for another buyer. and another buyer comes along, and the second buyer comes along, and yes, we want to buy the home, and yes, we can offer more money or terms, and they wouldn't have access to that first contract, but let's say they are going to come in with a better deal, and let's say it's cash with no contingencies. The seller still has to give the first buyer the opportunity, and this is where the kick out clause is, within a time period of, and that's open 24, 48, 72 hours, to actually release the contingency of getting their home sold or closed, that type of thing. So first buyer is given the opportunity to get rid of the contingency and say, okay, we're getting rid of it. They don't have to go up to the price. They just have to get rid of the contingency. They get rid of the contingency and say, you know what? All right, our contract is no longer contingent on the home selling or blah, 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 or closing, whatever it is. Then the seller has to abide by the rest of the terms. Okay. If they do not, and they do not release that contingency within 24 or 48 or 72 hours, whatever's negotiated in the kickout clause, then the seller can go to option B or option 2, whether it's inferior or better or superior. They can still go there, but they cannot take that second contract until they give the first buyer sufficient time. That's what the kickout clause does. Hopefully that wasn't confusing. If you have questions about that, if you have comments or even history around it, leave it in the chat. Very, very interesting how that happens and how that occurs. So those are the probably 7 or 8 plus takeaways, subject to the lease, taxes, paid in arrears. We talked about down payment. We talked about escrow, property maintenance, access to the property, and kickout clause. Questions, let me know. Happy Friday. Hope everybody's doing well. And as always, if you have questions, please let me know. But like it, subscribe. That would be fabulous. And we'll see you real soon. Take care.